She thought she'd buried the truth with him, but his war dog uncovered the secret they were willing to kill for. My stepmother kicked out a homeless Navy SEAL. His dog found what they hid inside a granary. The lock clicked behind Caleb Mercer like a final verdict. Snow drifted across the Wyoming foothills as he stood with nothing but a duffel bag and a scarred Belgian Malinois at his side. The only thing left to him was a rusted granary on the north pasture, worthless, debt-ridden, forgotten. But when his dog began clawing beneath the old way station, Caleb realized this wasn't abandonment. It was a setup. Comment 1 if you'd stand your ground, or 0 if you'd walk away, and tell us where you're watching from. The Wyoming wind cut across the open pasture like a blade, dry and sharp, carrying the scent of dust and old hay. Caleb Mercer stood at the end of the long gravel driveway and looked at the ranch house he had grown up in. The paint was newer now. The porch light had been replaced. The fence had been reinforced. Small changes, careful changes. But the front door was the same. Viper stood close to Caleb's left leg, lean and alert despite the slight hitch in his gait. The Belgian Malinois' amber eyes tracked every movement of the house as if it were hostile terrain. A faded service harness still rested across his back, the stitching worn from years overseas. The scar along his flank caught the light when he shifted. Caleb adjusted the strap on his duffel bag and walked forward. He hadn't called ahead. He didn't trust his voice enough to make that call. After months drifting between VA housing and sleeping in the cab of his pickup truck, pride had already been swallowed too many times. Coming back here felt like another mission he wasn't sure he wanted. The porch boards creaked under his boots. He knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. Elaine Mercer stood framed in the doorway, her hair pulled tight, her expression controlled. She looked older than Caleb remembered, but not softer, not kinder. "You're back," she said. Caleb gave a small nod. "Just until I get on my feet." Viper's ears flicked forward. Elaine's eyes dropped briefly to the dog, then back to Caleb. "You should have called." "I didn't think I needed an appointment to come home." The word hung between them. Home. Elaine stepped aside just enough to block the entrance. "This isn't your home anymore, Caleb." He blinked once, steady. "What are you talking about?" She handed him a thick manila envelope. Official seals, legal language. Caleb recognized the weight of paperwork immediately. It had the same sterile gravity as discharge documents and after-action reports. "The ranch is under contract," Elaine said evenly. "We're in final negotiations with a development firm. I can't have disruptions." Caleb flipped through the pages. Sale agreements, transfer clauses. His name nowhere except on a small addendum. "What is this?" he asked quietly. "Your inheritance." He stopped turning pages. "You're not listed on the ranch deed," she continued. "Your father structured things differently. After probate, the only property transferred solely to you was the old North Pasture granary." Caleb looked past her shoulder toward the kitchen window. He could almost see his father sitting at the table, boots kicked off, coffee mug steaming beside him. "The granary?" he repeated. "It's condemned," Elaine said. "Structural issues, back taxes. There's a corporate lien pending. Honestly, it's more liability than asset." The wind gusted, slamming a loose shutter against the siding. Viper's muscles tightened. "You're saying I can't stay here," Caleb said slowly. "I'm saying the sale requires vacant possession." Her voice was careful, rehearsed. "The buyers don't want complications." "Complications?" "You've been unstable, Caleb." Her eyes flicked briefly to the scar along his jaw. "The VA reports, the incident in Billings." His jaw tightened. "That was a misunderstanding." It was a bar fight. It was a panic response. Silence stretched across the porch. Somewhere in the distance, a gate clanged against metal fencing. "I can't risk the sale," Elaine said finally. "I have obligations." "To who?" Caleb asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward and placed a small set of keys into his palm. They were old iron keys, heavy and cold. "The granary sits about a mile north. That's yours now. The deed's in the envelope. After the sale closes, you won't have access to this property anymore." The words didn't hit like a punch. They hit like frost, slow and numbing. Caleb stared at the keys. For a moment, a memory surfaced without warning. Standing at this same door at 18, watching movers carry out his father's old oak desk after the funeral. The lock had changed then too. Elaine had called it a fresh start. Viper let out a low growl. Elaine's posture stiffened. "Control your dog. He is under control. Make sure he stays that way." Caleb slid the keys into his pocket and closed the envelope. He didn't argue. Didn't shout. Didn't beg. He had learned a long time ago that volume never won a battle. "Fine," he said. He stepped off the porch and walked back toward his truck. Gravel crunched under his boots. The sky above the Wyoming foothills was turning copper, clouds catching fire as the sun sank behind distant ridges. Halfway down the driveway, he paused and looked back. Elaine still stood in the doorway, arms folded. The house lights flickered on behind her, warm and distant. She closed the door. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed louder than it should have. Caleb stood very still. He felt it then. Not shock, not grief, but something tighter. A compression in his chest that he had felt once before, overseas, when orders changed and safe ground disappeared. Viper pressed his side against Caleb's leg. "I know," Caleb murmured. He climbed into the truck. The engine coughed once before turning over. In the rearview mirror, the ranch house grew smaller as he drove away, swallowed by the wide Wyoming dusk. The north pasture lay beyond a stretch of broken fencing and tall, wind-beaten grass. As he crested the low rise, the granary came into view. It was enormous, a towering cluster of rust-streaked silos and corrugated steel walls, rising against the darkening mountains like a relic from another era. Windows were cracked. The roofline sagged in places. The way station platform jutted out front like a forgotten stage. Viper sat upright in the passenger seat, staring at it. Caleb killed the engine. "Well," he said quietly, "guess this is ours." The wind swept across the pasture, rattling loose tin sheets and whispering through dry grass. Caleb stepped out of the truck and stood facing the structure. Humiliation burned low in his gut. Not loud, not wild, but steady. He had survived combat. He had survived losing men under his command. He had survived coming home to silence and paperwork, and nights that wouldn't let him sleep. And now he had inherited a condemned granary. He let out a slow breath. "All right," he muttered. Viper moved ahead of him toward the building, nose to the wind, alert. The sky dimmed to deep blue. The mountains faded into shadow. Caleb tightened his grip on the duffel bag strap and followed his dog toward the rusted doors of the granary. If this was what he'd been left with, he would at least see it for himself. Behind him, unseen in the distance, headlights flickered briefly along the ridge road before disappearing again. The wind shifted. Viper stopped and looked back toward the horizon, ears forward, listening. Caleb didn't notice. Not yet. He was focused on the weight of the keys Schauf was in his pocket, and the silhouette of the granary rising against the darkening Wyoming sky. The building looked less like an inheritance and more like a forgotten fortress, battered, isolated, and standing long after its purpose had faded. Viper moved first, paws crunching over dry grass and gravel. His limp was subtle but constant, a reminder of a night overseas Caleb rarely allowed himself to replay. The dog paused at the sagging chain-link gate and glanced back, waiting. Caleb unlocked the gate with the smallest of the iron keys. It took effort. Rust resisted him, metal grinding against metal before finally giving way with a sharp crack. The gate swung open with a long, aching scream. They stepped through. The wind died slightly inside the perimeter fence. It felt quieter here, heavier. The granary towered above them, its silos casting long shadows across the dirt yard. The old sliding doors were chained shut with a padlock almost as old as the keys in Caleb's pocket. He tried one key after another until the fourth slid cleanly into place. The lock opened. The door didn't. Caleb set his duffel down and braced his shoulder against the cold steel. He pushed. The door groaned and scraped across its track, protesting decades of neglect before finally opening just wide enough for a man and a dog to slip inside. The air hit him first. Dry grain dust, rust, and something older beneath it. The interior stretched upward into darkness, steel beams disappearing into shadow. Faded conveyor belts hung motionless overhead. The way station platform sat in the center of the floor like an altar. Caleb stepped in slowly, boots echoing against the concrete. The sound triggered something in his chest, a sudden tightening, like distant mortar fire reverberating through abandoned buildings. He stopped moving. Breathe in. 4 counts. Hold. 4 counts. Exhale. Viper circled back to him and pressed his side against Caleb's thigh. The steady contact grounded him. The dog's breathing was calm, measured. No threat detected. Just a building, Caleb murmured. He closed the door behind them, leaving a narrow crack for moonlight. The granary swallowed the rest. He moved methodically, the way he had been trained. Clear corners, check entry points, identify exits. Old habits weren't habits. They were survival systems. The office sat at the far end of the structure, a small room with cracked glass windows overlooking the pasture. Caleb forced the swollen wooden door open and found a rusted desk, a filing cabinet hanging ajar, and layers of dust thick enough to dull his boot prints. "This'll do," he said quietly. He unpacked his gear with military precision. Sleeping roll against the far wall, lantern centered on the desk, emergency kit placed within reach. Viper lay down near the doorway, but kept his head raised. Outside, the Wyoming wind returned, sliding along the steel walls in a low moan. Caleb sat on the edge of the desk and opened the envelope Elaine had handed him. The deed was legitimate. The granary parcel had been transferred solely to him after Harold's death. No shared ownership, no safety net. The tax notice was worse. Nearly $80,000 in back payments and penalties. And then the lien. Blackridge Infrastructure. The corporate letterhead was clean and sharp, too clean for something tied to a dying agricultural building. According to the document, Blackridge had a contractual claim pending against the property, citing breach of sale agreement with Harold Mercer. Caleb frowned. He didn't remember his father ever mentioning negotiations. He flipped through more pages. Legal language blurred together, but the message was clear. The building was scheduled for seizure pending review. "Worthless," he muttered. Viper rose abruptly. The dog moved toward the center of the granary floor, paws clicking against concrete. He circled the way station platform slowly, nose sweeping the surface. His tail lowered slightly. Not fear, but focus. "What is it?" Caleb asked. Viper sniffed along the edge of one of the steel plates embedded in the floor. Then he pawed at it once. Caleb watched, curious but not alarmed. "You smell mice?" The dog ignored him and continued pacing around the platform, nose down, occasionally stopping to sniff the seams between the plates and the concrete. Caleb stood and walked closer. The weigh station was massive, a 20-foot steel platform flush with the floor, once used to measure incoming grain trucks. The metal was worn but solid. He tapped it with his boot. It gave back a dull, heavy thud. Viper pawed again, harder this time. Caleb crouched and ran his hand along the edge. Dust filled his fingernails. He found nothing obvious. No handle, no latch. "Easy," he said gently. The dog finally backed away but did not relax. He sat facing the platform, eyes locked on it, as if guarding something. Caleb felt that tightening again, not panic, but awareness. He stood and walked the perimeter of the interior once more. Windows were broken, but too narrow for easy entry. The roof showed signs of patchwork repairs from years ago. The structure, though worn, was solid. He returned to the office and sat down heavily. The emotional weight settled in now that movement had stopped. Humiliation from the ranch, the echo of Elaine's voice, the hollow cavern of this building. It pressed in on him from all sides. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring at the dust-covered floor. "I can't keep doing this," he whispered to no one. The VA counselor's voice echoed faintly in his memory. High-stress triggers should be avoided. Isolation increases risk factors. Avoid environments that mirror combat conditions. This place mirrored them perfectly. Large enclosed spaces, metal echoes, shadows that shifted with every movement of light. He rubbed his face with both hands. Viper returned to his side and placed his chin gently on Caleb's knee. Caleb's breathing steadied. "I know," he said softly. Outside, a faint sound carried on the wind. Tires on gravel. Distant. Caleb froze. The sound faded as quickly as it had come. He waited another full minute before moving. Silence. Probably nothing. Still, he rose and stepped outside the office, scanning the yard through the open crack in the door. The pasture lay empty beneath the moonlight. The road beyond the hill was dark. He closed the door more firmly. Inside, the granary settled again into its heavy stillness. Caleb returned to the office and clicked off the lantern, leaving only a narrow beam from his flashlight angled upward toward the ceiling. He lay back on the sleeping roll. Viper positioned himself between Caleb and the doorway. The building creaked once. Caleb stared into the darkness above him. Worthless inheritance. Condemned building. Corporate lien. And yet Blackridge wanted it badly enough to attach a claim and send legal threats before he had even slept his first night here. That didn't feel random. That felt intentional. The suspicion was small, just a spark, but it refused to die. Caleb closed his eyes. Outside, on the far ridge beyond the pasture fence, headlights flickered again, this time lingering for several seconds before slowly turning away. Inside the granary, Viper's ears twitched once. Caleb didn't notice. Not yet. The first light of dawn crept over the eastern ridge, spilling pale gold across the frost-tipped grass. Inside the granary, the cold had settled deep into the concrete floor overnight. Caleb woke the way he always did, abruptly, alert, scanning shadows before his mind fully caught up with reality. For a split second, the steel beams above him were not beams, but the ribs of a collapsed warehouse halfway across the world. The wind scraping against the siding became distant rotor wash. His pulse spiked. Then Viper shifted beside him, pressing a warm flank against Caleb's arm. Wyoming. Granary. Safe. He exhaled slowly and pushed himself upright. The lantern light had died hours ago, but morning sunlight filtered through broken windows in narrow shafts, illuminating suspended dust like drifting smoke. Viper was already on his feet, ears angled toward the front entrance. "You hear something?" Caleb asked quietly. The dog didn't bark. He didn't growl, he simply stared. Caleb moved toward the narrow gap in the main door and eased it open another inch. The pasture looked calm, wind rippling through tall grass, distant mountains washed in early light. And then he saw it. A black SUV cresting the dirt road. It wasn't speeding. It wasn't reckless. It moved with deliberate control, tires crunching softly over gravel as it approached the gate Caleb had unlocked the night before. The vehicle stopped, engine idling. Viper's muscles tightened. Caleb stepped fully outside and closed the granary door behind him, leaving Viper at his side. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of exhaust and something chemical, clean, sharp, artificial. The SUV door opened. A man stepped out wearing a tailored charcoal suit and polished boots entirely unsuited for a north pasture. His hair was neatly parted, sunglasses reflecting the rising sun. He did not look like a ranch hand. He looked like a presentation. "Mr. Mercer?" the man called calmly. Caleb didn't answer immediately. The man approached but stopped a respectful distance away. "Nathan Kessler, Blackridge Infrastructure." "Of course." Caleb folded his arms. "You drove a long way to admire a condemned building." Kessler smiled slightly. "We prefer to stay ahead of complications." Viper shifted position, subtly placing himself half a step forward. Kessler's eyes flicked down briefly to the dog, then back to Caleb. His posture remained relaxed, but Caleb noticed the faint bulge beneath the suit jacket near the waist. Concealed carry. Viper noticed it first. The dog's hackles rose almost imperceptibly. "We understand this property was recently transferred to you," Kessler continued smoothly. "We'd like to make this easy." "Easy for who?" Caleb asked. "For you." Kessler gestured toward the granary. "That structure is structurally compromised. It carries significant tax debt. There's an active lien attached. You inherited a financial burden." Caleb said nothing. Kessler pulled a thin envelope from inside his jacket. "Blackridge is prepared to forgive the lien in full. Additionally, we're authorized to offer a cash settlement in exchange for immediate transfer of ownership." "How generous," Caleb replied. "It's practical," Kessler corrected. "You walk away debt-free. No litigation, no complications." The word again, complications. Caleb looked past Kessler toward the horizon, where the pasture met distant timberline. "What do you want with a condemned granary?" Kessler's smile thinned. "We have development interests in this region." "Development," Caleb repeated. "Energy storage, infrastructure upgrades, long-term investment." The phrases sounded memorized. Viper let out a low growl. Kessler's expression didn't change, but his right hand subtly shifted closer to his jacket seam. Caleb caught the movement. The air tightened. "Easy," Caleb murmured softly. To Viper, not to Kessler. The dog's growl lowered but did not disappear. "You see," Kessler continued, "prolonged disputes create stress, and I've read enough about your service record to know you've had enough stress." Caleb's eyes snapped back to him. "My service record isn't public. We do our research." There it was, the first fracture in the polished delivery. Caleb's jaw hardened. Let me be clear, Kessler said, tone still measured. You cannot afford to maintain this property. The county will move on foreclosure. Blackridge will secure the asset regardless. Signing now simply spares you unnecessary strain. Caleb stepped closer, closing the distance by a foot. You sure about that? He asked quietly. Kessler held his ground. Very. Wind swept across the pasture, lifting loose dirt in small spirals. For a moment, the scene felt suspended. Two men facing each other in open land, mountains rising behind them. Caleb thought about the paperwork in the office. The lien filed before he'd even stepped inside. The headlights on the ridge the night before. Blackridge hadn't waited to see if he'd give up. They had expected it. Why the hurry? Caleb asked. No hurry, Kessler replied smoothly. Just efficiency. Then you won't mind if I review everything first. Kessler's smile faded entirely now. You won't win this, Mr. Mercer. The words were not loud. They were not shouted. They were stated like a weather report. Caleb studied the man's face. No anger, no heat, just calculation. Maybe not, Caleb said, but I'll decide that. Silence settled between them. Finally, Kessler slid the envelope back into his jacket. Take a few days, he said, but I'd advise against drawing attention. Rural disputes can escalate in unfortunate ways. Viper's growl returned, sharper this time. Kessler gave the dog one last glance, then turned and walked back toward the SUV. Gravel shifted under his polished boots. The vehicle door closed with a soft click. The engine revved once. Then the SUV rolled away, disappearing down the dirt road in a plume of dust. Caleb remained standing long after it vanished from view. The emotional tone had shifted. This was no longer about humiliation. It was about territory. Viper stepped forward and sniffed the tire tracks left in the dirt. His nose lingered, memorizing scent. Caleb looked back at the granary. The building no longer felt abandoned. It felt watched. He walked back inside, closing the steel door fully this time and securing the chain from within. Sunlight streamed through cracks in the walls, illuminating the way station platform again in pale light. Viper returned to it immediately. He sniffed along the seam between steel plate and concrete, more intensely now. Still that spot? Caleb muttered. The dog pawed once, hard. Caleb crouched down beside him and ran his hand along the edge again. The metal felt colder than the rest of the floor. His suspicion deepened. Blackridge wanted this property too badly, and they were willing to threaten him for it. He tapped the steel plate with his knuckles. The sound echoed differently this time. Lower. Hollow. Caleb froze. Viper stared at him, ears forward. The morning sunlight shifted across the platform, casting new shadows over the seams. Caleb reached for the pry bar leaning against the office wall. Behind him, the Wyoming wind rose again, rattling loose tin sheets like distant thunder. The emotional balance had changed. Humiliation had burned off. In its place stood something steadier, controlled anger, and beneath it, curiosity. It settled in Caleb's chest like a slow-burning ember. Not panic, not anger. Something quieter and more dangerous. He stood over the way station platform, pry bar in hand, watching Viper circle the steel plates again. The dog's movements were precise now, nose tracing the same narrow seam along the eastern edge of the platform. "You're sure about this?" Caleb muttered. Viper stopped, looked up at him, and pawed once more, firm, deliberate. Caleb knelt and ran his palm along the seam. The metal was colder here, even under the morning sun filtering through broken windows. He pressed his ear to the plate, and tapped lightly with his knuckles. The echo that came back wasn't solid. It carried depth. He stood, slid the pry bar into the seam, and leaned his weight against it. Nothing. He adjusted the angle and pushed harder. The bar groaned against steel. A faint metallic creak answered from somewhere below the platform. Viper stepped back, muscles tense. Caleb paused, listening. The granary held its breath. Wind scraped against the siding, rattling loose panels. Dust swirled through beams of light like drifting smoke. Somewhere in the rafters, an old belt pulley shifted slightly under its own weight. Caleb reset his grip and pulled again. This time, the plate lifted. Not much, but enough. A thin line of darkness appeared beneath the edge. His pulse ticked up. He wedged the pry bar deeper and lifted with both hands. The steel plate rose slowly, heavy but not immovable, revealing a recessed cavity beneath the weigh station. Caleb lowered it carefully to one side. Underneath lay a square hatch door made of reinforced steel, fitted flush into a concrete frame. It wasn't old farm construction. It was clean, intentional, the kind of hatch designed to stay hidden. Viper's breathing deepened, nostrils flaring. Caleb crouched lower, brushing away decades of dust from the hatch edges. His fingers found a recessed pull handle near the corner, disguised beneath a thin layer of oxidized metal. "This wasn't county work," he murmured. He tugged gently. The hatch resisted at first, suctioned shut by time. He shifted his stance and pulled harder. With a hollow metallic sigh, the hatch lifted. Cool air drifted upward from below, dry and faintly metallic. Caleb angled his flashlight downward. The beam cut through darkness to reveal a ladder bolted into concrete, descending about 6 feet into a narrow underground chamber. He hesitated. The rational voice in his mind suggested closing the hatch and calling a lawyer, or at least someone else. But curiosity had already taken hold. Viper whined softly. Not fear, but alertness. Caleb slung the flashlight over his wrist and lowered himself onto the ladder. The concrete was cool beneath his boots as he stepped into the chamber. It was barely large enough to stand upright in. Reinforced walls, no moisture seepage, no visible wiring. And in the center of the floor, a case, not wooden, not plastic, military grade. Dark olive drab, reinforced corners, dual locking clasps. The surface bore faded lettering, nearly erased by time, but still visible under the beam. U.S. Government Contract Unit. Caleb's breath stalled. He knelt slowly and ran his fingers across the case. The metal was scratched, but intact. No corrosion, no obvious damage. Viper descended behind him carefully, positioning himself at Caleb's back as if guarding the entrance. "You smell anything?" Caleb asked quietly. Viper's ears twitched once. He leaned forward and sniffed the case, then sat back on his haunches, steady, waiting. Caleb examined the clasps. They were locked, but not with an external padlock. Integrated latch locks. He scanned the interior walls of the chamber with his flashlight. Nothing else. No wiring, no secondary compartments. Just the case. "Dad," Caleb whispered under his breath. Harold Mercer had been a rancher, a practical man. He had taught Caleb how to fix fence lines, how to read wind patterns, how to ride through snow without losing direction. He had never mentioned government contracts. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out the small multi-tool he carried everywhere. The tool felt familiar in his hand, grounding. He examined the latches more closely. There, faint indentations. Combination dials worn nearly smooth. He wiped dust away and tilted the flashlight to catch the light at an angle. 3 digits per latch. He closed his eyes briefly. What would his father choose? Birth dates were too obvious. Military unit numbers? Harold had never served. Caleb looked again at the faded contract code printed on the case surface. The last 3 numbers remained barely legible. 214. He tried it on the first dial. The latch clicked softly. Viper's ears shot forward. Caleb set the same combination on the second latch. Another click. The chamber seemed to tighten around him. He lifted the lid slowly. The hinges opened without resistance. Inside, foam lining cushioned several sealed waterproof pouches and 2 encrypted hard drives secured in molded compartments. A smaller digital recorder sat on top, wrapped in protective plastic. Caleb didn't move at first. He stared. The emotional shift was immediate. Not triumph, not yet, but confirmation. Blackridge hadn't been interested in scrap metal. They had been interested in this. Viper leaned closer, nose hovering above the open case, but did not touch anything. Caleb reached inside carefully and lifted one of the sealed pouches. Inside were printed documents, soil analysis reports, sampling coordinates, chemical composition breakdowns, industrial solvent traces, heavy metal contamination, rail spur access maps. He swallowed. The second pouch contained photographs, satellite images of surrounding farmland marked with red grid overlays, and beneath those, a small portable digital recorder. His hand hovered over it. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the granary walls overhead. Caleb lifted the recorder and turned it over in his hand. There was a single file saved. Date stamp, 2 years prior. The same year his father had died. His thumb trembled slightly as he pressed play. Static crackled softly. Then a voice emerged. Caleb. It was unmistakable. Harold Mercer. Caleb froze. Viper looked up sharply at the sound. If you're hearing this, the voice continued, steady but lower than Caleb remembered, then you found it. Good. The chamber felt suddenly smaller. I didn't know how much time I had. I couldn't risk keeping this at the house. Caleb lowered himself slowly onto the concrete floor, still gripping the recorder. You were trained to look past the obvious, Harold's voice went on, so I trusted you would. Caleb's chest tightened. Above them, something shifted, metal settling under temperature change. But down here, inside the chamber, the air felt still. Controlled anger faded. Curiosity gave way to something deeper. Revelation. He glanced at Viper. The dog remained steady, eyes fixed on Caleb as if understanding the gravity of the moment. The granary wasn't abandoned. It was a vault. And his father hadn't left him a burden. He had left him a secret. Caleb pressed the recorder tighter to his ear. The next words would change everything. Above them, unseen through broken window glass, a faint glint flashed from the distant ridge, a lens catching sunlight. Watching. Caleb didn't see it. Not yet. He didn't see the faint glint of glass on the ridge or the distant vehicle idling beyond the tree line. Down in the concrete chamber beneath the granary floor, his world had narrowed to a single sound. His father's voice. If you're hearing this, then you found it. Good. The recorder crackled softly. The words were clear, but layered with strain Caleb had never heard when his father was alive. I didn't have much time, Harold Mercer continued, and I couldn't risk keeping the evidence in the house. Blackridge was already circling. Caleb swallowed. Viper shifted closer, pressing his shoulder into Caleb's side as if anchoring him in place. Caleb, what I'm about to tell you may put you in danger. I pray it doesn't. But if I'm gone, you deserve the truth. The word truth seemed to echo inside the chamber. I discovered Blackridge Infrastructure has been illegally burying industrial chemical waste across multiple rural properties in this county. Not storage, not containment, burial. They use abandoned rail spurs and defunct agricultural sites to mask it. Caleb's eyes moved to the pouches beside him. The soil reports, the satellite images marked in red grids. I bought this granary to block one of their primary access points. It sits at the center of the old rail network. Without it, they can't complete their expansion grid. The recorder hissed briefly. They tried to buy me out. Then they tried to pressure me. When that didn't work, they made it clear they could make things difficult. Caleb's jaw tightened. Your stepmother doesn't know the details. I kept her out of it on purpose. If you're hearing this, it means they pushed too far. Maybe farther than I expected. A long pause followed. Caleb could hear faint breathing on the recording. I didn't tell you because I wanted you free of it. You served your country long enough. You earned peace. Caleb let out a quiet breath that trembled at the edges. But if you're standing there now, then you know peace doesn't always choose us. Viper's ears flicked at the tone in Caleb's breathing. I gathered everything I could, Harold continued. Soil samples, contract records, internal memos leaked by a subcontractor who grew a conscience. It's all in the case. Caleb reached for one of the sealed pouches and opened it carefully. Inside were printed emails between Blackridge executives and logistics coordinators. He recognized coded phrasing, terms like night deliveries and controlled dispersal. The language was sanitized. The implications were not. They've contaminated farmland, Harold said. There are elevated heavy metal readings in groundwater near at least 3 properties. If this expands, it will affect livestock, crops, and eventually families. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. He had grown up on this land. He knew the wells, the irrigation lines, the families who depended on them. I didn't go public yet, Harold's voice admitted. I needed more proof, something airtight, but I ran out of time. Caleb's grip tightened around the recorder. If they come for me, protect the land, protect yourself, trust your instincts. The recorder clicked softly, ending the file. Silence flooded the chamber. Caleb sat there for a long moment, listening to nothing but his own breathing and Viper's steady presence. Shock gave way to something heavier. Grief. The memory of his father collapsing at the kitchen table 2 years earlier came back in fragments. The paramedics. The sterile hospital corridor. The official explanation. Sudden cardiac arrest. Had it been sudden? Or had pressure, threats, stress chipped away at him until something broke? Caleb's chest tightened. He opened the second hard drive case and examined the encrypted devices. His training allowed him to recognize secure data formatting. Military-grade encryption software labels were still faintly visible. His father hadn't been reckless. He had been methodical. Fury followed grief like a shadow. Blackridge hadn't wanted scrap steel. They had wanted silence. Caleb stood abruptly, the movement echoing in the chamber. His head nearly brushed the low ceiling. Viper, he murmured. The dog rose immediately. Caleb climbed the ladder with the recorder in his hand. Viper followed close behind. Back inside the main granary floor, the morning light had shifted higher. Dust floated lazily in beams of sun. Caleb replaced the hatch cover, but did not lower the steel plate yet. He wanted quick access. He walked to the broken window facing the ridge and scanned the horizon. Empty pasture. No visible movement. but something in his gut refused to settle. He stepped outside and circled the building perimeter. Fresh tire impressions cut across the dirt near the fence line. Not from his truck. They hadn't been there yesterday. Viper sniffed the tracks, nostrils flaring. His posture stiffened. "They're watching," Caleb said quietly. The emotion inside him shifted again, shock hardening into resolve. He returned inside and secured the steel plate over the hatch, lowering it carefully into place. He brushed dust back across the seams with his boot, disguising any sign of disturbance. Then he carried the case up into the office. He set the documents across the rusted desk and began sorting them with focused intensity. Soil reports were dated across a 3-year span. Maps showed precise rail coordinates intersecting near the granary. An internal memo mentioned Mercer obstruction in a margin note. Caleb stared at that line. Obstruction. His father hadn't just been inconvenient. He had been a barrier someone wanted removed. The weight of the revelation pressed down hard. Caleb leaned forward, hands braced on the desk. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. The echo of boots in abandoned buildings returned to his ears, the memory of teammates lost during a mission gone wrong overseas, the feeling of being surrounded by forces you couldn't fully see. His pulse quickened. Viper immediately stood and placed both front paws against Caleb's thigh, grounding him. "Okay," Caleb breathed. "Okay." He knelt and pressed his forehead briefly against Viper's. "I'm here." The dog exhaled slowly, calming. Caleb straightened again. Anger now burned clean and controlled. He picked up the recorder once more and replayed the final line. "If they come for me, protect the land. Trust your instincts." Outside, a hawk circled overhead against the wide Wyoming sky. Caleb stepped to the doorway of the granary and looked out across the pasture. This building was no longer an embarrassment. It was evidence. It was motive. It was a battlefield marker drawn in steel and dust. And if Blackridge had forced his father into silence, Caleb felt the decision forming before he fully acknowledged it. He wouldn't run. Not yet, but the war had just become personal. Caleb stood in the doorway of the granary as the Wyoming wind swept across the north pasture, flattening the tall grass in long silver waves. The mountains beyond Crestfall rose quiet and indifferent, their snow-capped peaks glowing under the late afternoon sun. He had moved the military case back down into the hidden chamber and sealed the hatch carefully, brushing dust over the seams again. The recorder sat in his jacket pocket now, close to his chest. If Blackridge wanted this building, they were going to have to earn it. By nightfall, the temperature dropped sharply. Caleb lit a small lantern in the office and kept the rest of the granary dark. He ate from a ration pack, sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor, while Viper lay alert near the door. The silence inside the structure felt different now. It was no longer emptiness. It was anticipation. Around midnight, Caleb woke to stillness. The wind had died completely. He remained on his back, eyes open in the dark, listening. Viper was already upright. No growl, no bark, just tension. Caleb rolled slowly to his side and reached for the small flashlight beside his sleeping roll. He did not turn it on. A faint crunch of gravel echoed from outside the main entrance. Then another, measured, deliberate. Caleb's pulse accelerated, but his breathing remained steady. He moved silently to the office doorway and pressed his shoulder against the wall, listening through the steel siding. Metal scraped softly against metal. The rear access door. They weren't knocking. They were testing. Viper's ears flattened back, eyes sharp. "Stay," Caleb whispered. The scrape grew louder, a tool wedged against the door seam, pressure applied carefully. Caleb moved through the darkness without turning on a light. His body remembered this rhythm, the quiet steps, the calculated positioning. A sudden metallic snap rang out. The rear latch gave way. The door swung inward. Two shadows slipped through the opening. Both wore dark jackets and caps pulled low. One carried a flashlight angled toward the ground. The other held something long and narrow, not raised, but ready. Caleb's vision tunneled for a split second. The echo of forced entry overseas, the crack of gunfire in distant alleys. His heart slammed against his ribs. Then Viper moved. The dog lunged forward with a low, explosive growl, targeting the intruder closest to Caleb. The man barely had time to react before Viper collided with his legs, sending him stumbling backward. The second intruder pivoted, raising his arm. Caleb surged forward from the shadows, grabbing the attacker's wrist and twisting sharply downward. The object clattered to the floor, a heavy flashlight, not a weapon, but the intent was clear. "Out!" Caleb barked. The first man tried to regain footing, but Viper had locked onto his forearm, teeth clamped through fabric. The man shouted in pain. Caleb struck the second intruder's forearm with controlled force, disarming him fully and pushing him back toward the open doorway. "I said out!" The echo of his own voice startled him, louder than he intended. The second intruder dragged his partner free with effort, both retreating through the broken rear entrance. They stumbled into the dark pasture and disappeared toward a waiting vehicle. An engine roared to life. Headlights flared briefly against the steel siding. Then silence. Caleb stood frozen for a moment, chest rising fast. The flashback threatened again. The split second where past and present blur. Viper released his grip and returned immediately to Caleb's side. Caleb blinked hard and forced his breathing down. 4 counts in. Hold. 4 counts out. "I'm here," he whispered to himself. He turned on his flashlight and swept the beam across the floor. The rear door hung crooked on its hinges. The latch plate had been pried loose. On the concrete near the doorway lay something dropped in the scuffle. Caleb crouched and picked it up. A laminated contractor badge. Black Ridge Infrastructure. Name partially scratched away. The logo unmistakable. They hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to search. Caleb stepped outside briefly, scanning the pasture. The vehicle lights were gone, swallowed by the darkness beyond the ridge. He returned inside and closed the damaged rear door as best he could, securing it with a length of chain from the equipment room. Viper circled the granary perimeter once more, nose down, ensuring the threat had truly withdrawn. When the dog returned, Caleb finally noticed it. A dark streak along Viper's shoulder, blood. "Hold still," Caleb murmured, kneeling. The gash wasn't deep, but it was long, likely from scraping against a sharp metal edge during the takedown. Caleb moved quickly, retrieving his medical kit from the office. His hands were steady now, the earlier surge replaced by cold focus. He cleaned the wound carefully. Viper didn't flinch. "You're not getting soft on me," Caleb said quietly. The dog's tail thumped once against the concrete. As Caleb wrapped the bandage, his anger sharpened into something precise. They had escalated, which meant the evidence below was real enough to threaten them. He stood slowly and looked toward the center of the granary, where the way station plate lay undisturbed. "They don't know where it is," he muttered. "Not yet." The emotion shifted again. Fear had flared. Instinct had taken over. Now resolve settled heavier than before. He walked to the front entrance and opened it slightly, letting in cold night air. The stars above the Wyoming sky burned sharp and clear, indifferent witnesses to what had just happened. Caleb stepped onto the loading dock and scanned the horizon. They would come again. But next time, he would be ready. Behind him, Viper limped forward and sat beside him, eyes scanning the dark pasture. Two figures standing against a vast field. Not victims, not anymore. The war had moved from paperwork to steel and bone, and Caleb understood something clearly now. This was no longer about an inheritance. It was about territory, and he wasn't surrendering it. But as the adrenaline drained from his system and the cold Wyoming night pressed in, Caleb felt the cost of that decision settling into his bones. He dragged an old metal barrel out onto the loading dock and lit a small fire inside it, feeding it splintered fence boards and broken pallet wood he'd found near the storage shed. The flames flickered low and steady, throwing long orange shadows across the granary walls. Viper lay on a folded blanket beside him, shoulder bandaged, eyes half closed but alert. Caleb sat on an overturned crate, elbows on his knees, staring into the fire. The pasture was quiet again. Too quiet. His body still hummed from the confrontation, muscles tight, senses sharp, every distant sound amplified. A branch snapping in the wind felt like a rifle crack. A shifting tin sheet sounded like a breech charge. He pressed his fingers against his temples. Easy, he muttered to himself. He had promised his VA counselor he wouldn't put himself in volatile situations, that he would avoid isolation, avoid triggers. And here he was, alone in a rusted steel building with men who wanted something buried beneath it. He looked over at Viper. "You didn't sign up for this again," he said softly. The dog opened one eye, watching him. Caleb reached out and rested a hand gently on Viper's back, careful to avoid the wound. "I could walk away," he said aloud, testing the words. The wind moved through the tall grass beyond the loading dock, a long whisper across open land. He pictured the envelope Kessler had offered. Debt erased, cash in hand. He could drive south, find work somewhere quiet. Construction, security, something that didn't involve corporate surveillance and midnight break-ins. He could leave the evidence in the ground where Blackridge wanted it. He could survive. But the image of his father's voice on the recorder rose again in his mind. Protect the land. Trust your instincts. Caleb closed his eyes. He remembered being 12 years old, standing beside Harold on this very pasture during a summer storm. The sky had turned green and angry. Lightning had cracked across the ridge. "Land isn't just dirt," Harold had said, tightening fence wire with strong, calloused hands. "It's memory. It's responsibility." Caleb had rolled his eyes back then. Now those words felt like a weight. The fire popped, sending sparks upward into the dark. His breathing began to shallow. The crackling wood turned to echoing gunfire in his mind. He saw flashes, debris, smoke, a teammate's voice shouting through static. His chest tightened. Viper moved immediately. The dog rose despite the bandage and pressed his body against Caleb's legs, forcing physical contact. Caleb blinked hard. He wasn't overseas. He was in Wyoming. The fire was real. The night was quiet. He leaned forward and rested his forehead against Viper's. "Stay with me," he whispered. Viper's breathing was steady, anchored. Caleb inhaled slowly, counting under his breath. 4. Hold. 4. The panic crest faded. Silence settled again, this time gentler. He leaned back on the crate and looked up at the stars. They stretched wide and endless above the foothills, brighter than any sky he'd seen overseas. "You ever get tired?" he asked the dog quietly. Viper's ears flicked, but he didn't move. "I'm tired," Caleb admitted. The honesty surprised him. He wasn't tired of fighting. He was tired of losing ground, tired of coming home to doors that locked behind him, tired of proving he was stable enough to exist. The idea of surrender whispered again. Sign the papers. Let it go, heal somewhere else. The granary creaked softly in the night air. A cold draft moved through the broken rear door where the latch had been forced earlier. Caleb made a mental note to reinforce it in the morning. He stared at the darkness beyond the loading dock. They won't stop, he said. Blackridge had already escalated. They had threatened. They had trespassed. If he walked away now, they would erase the last obstruction. The land would be cleared, the evidence buried, and his father's last fight would end quietly. Viper shifted and nudged Caleb's knee with his nose. The motion was gentle, but insistent. Caleb glanced down at him. The dog's eyes were steady, not afraid, not confused, present. Caleb exhaled slowly. You don't quit, he murmured. Viper's tail thumped once against the wood. The fire burned lower, embers glowing red beneath soft ash. Caleb reached into his jacket and pulled out the recorder again. He didn't press play. He simply held it in his hand, feeling its weight. He imagined signing the property over, driving away, never looking back. For a moment, the idea felt like relief. No more headlights on the ridge. No more hidden chambers. No more corporate badges left on concrete floors. Just distance. But relief came with a cost. Cowardice. Abandonment. He had lived with that feeling once before. The guilt of surviving when others didn't. Of stepping off planes while some names never returned home. He would not add his father's name to that list of unfinished fights. The wind shifted again, cooler now. Caleb stood slowly and tossed another piece of wood into the barrel. The flames rose briefly, casting light across the granary doors. I'm not leaving, he said quietly. The words felt solid once spoken, not loud, not dramatic, certain. Viper rose carefully and leaned into Caleb's leg. Inside the granary, beneath the way station, the hidden chamber held its secret. Above it, the steel walls reflected firelight and starlight in equal measure. Caleb stared across the pasture one last time before extinguishing the barrel fire. Tomorrow, he would move beyond survival. Tomorrow, he would start asking questions in town. Tonight, he chose. And in that choice, something inside him shifted. The fear was still there, but it no longer led. He and the dog stepped back into the granary together. The war had become personal, and he had decided to stay. Morning came slow and pale over Crestfall, Wyoming. A thin frost clung to the pasture grass, sparkling under the rising sun. Caleb stood outside the granary with a mug of black coffee brewed over a camp stove, watching steam drift into the cold air. Viper moved carefully, but steadily, testing his bandaged shoulder. The wound looked clean. The dog's eyes were bright. You're not sitting this one out, Caleb murmured. Neither am I. He cleaned up the signs of the previous night's break-in, reinforcing the rear door with scrap steel and a heavy chain. The way station hatch remained sealed, dust brushed smooth again. If Blackridge returned, they would find nothing new. By mid-morning, Caleb climbed into his pickup and drove toward town. The road into Crestfall curved along low ridges and cut through open pasture land dotted with old barns and grazing cattle. The mountains framed the horizon in sharp blue. Crestfall itself was small. One main street, a diner, a feed store, a gas station, a hardware shop. The kind of place where everyone noticed new vehicles and strangers. Caleb parked across from the diner. He stepped out, adjusting his jacket. Viper followed, drawing curious glances from two older men seated outside the feed store. Inside the diner, the smell of coffee and frying bacon wrapped around him like a memory. The booths were worn red vinyl. A mounted elk head watched over the counter. Elaine sat alone in a corner booth. She looked surprised when Caleb approached, but not entirely unprepared. "You're still here," she said. "Yes," Caleb replied evenly. He slid into the booth opposite her. Viper lay beneath the table, eyes alert. Elaine stirred her coffee slowly. "You should have taken the offer." "I wasn't offered anything honest." Her gaze sharpened slightly. "You don't know what you're dealing with." "I know enough." Silence fell between them. The clatter of dishes and low conversations filled the background. Caleb leaned forward. "They broke into the granary last night." Elaine's hand froze mid-stir. "They left a Blackridge badge behind." Color drained slightly from her face. "I told you," she whispered. "You shouldn't have stayed." "You knew they'd come?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "They made it clear they didn't want complications. Complications like me. Complications like the building remaining unsold." Caleb's voice lowered. "What did they promise you?" Elaine looked away, toward the diner window where wind pushed loose paper across the sidewalk. "They paid off the ranch debt," she said quietly. "Cleared every outstanding loan. I was drowning, Caleb. After your father passed, the numbers didn't work. The cattle market dropped. Insurance premiums rose. I was going to lose everything. So you handed it to them." "They approached me first," she said, defensive now. "They knew about the tax liens on the granary. They knew about the rail access. They said it was routine development." "Did you believe them?" Her silence answered. "They told me if I removed you from the ranch and ensured the granary transferred cleanly, they'd resolve the rest." Caleb felt the old anger flare, but something beneath it shifted. "You were protecting yourself," he said flatly. "I was protecting the only thing I had left," she replied. "And what about Dad?" Elaine's expression hardened briefly, then faltered. "He became obsessed," she admitted. "After he bought the granary, he spent nights away. He said he was researching soil patterns, that he was preserving history." Caleb watched her carefully. "He received phone calls," she continued. "He'd step outside to answer them. After those calls, he looked different." "Scared?" "Determined," she said. "But yes, worried." The waitress approached with a refill. Neither of them moved. "Did he ever tell you about Blackridge?" Caleb asked. Elaine shook her head slowly. "They came to me after his funeral," she said. "They said they were cleaning up outstanding matters. They were polite, professional. They implied things could become difficult if assets weren't consolidated quickly." "Threats? Suggestions?" Caleb leaned back. "So you pushed me out to keep things smooth." "I thought if you signed it over, it would end," she said quietly. "You've already been through enough. I didn't want you dragged into more." Caleb studied her face. For years he had framed her as the villain. Cold, calculating, unfeeling. Now she looked tired, still selfish, but not orchestrating corporate espionage. "You were never the target," Caleb said slowly. She looked up. "They were never after you," he continued. "They were after what Dad hid." Elaine's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. What did he hide? Caleb hesitated. He could tell her everything. The chamber, the evidence, the recording. But trust did not rebuild in a single morning. "Enough," he said finally. Elaine leaned forward. "You don't understand how powerful they are," she whispered. They have lawyers, contracts, connections in Cheyenne. You're one man in a broken building. Caleb's jaw tightened. I'm not alone. She glanced beneath the table where Viper lay still and watchful. You're stubborn, she said. I learned from him. The words landed heavier than he expected. Elaine's eyes softened for the first time. Your father loved you, she said quietly, even when he didn't know how to say it. Caleb swallowed. He stood slowly. If they contact you again, tell me. Elaine hesitated. I don't want trouble. It's already here, Caleb replied. He stepped out of the booth and walked toward the door. Viper followed close. Outside, the town looked peaceful. Trucks parked along the curb, an American flag snapping lightly above the post office. But Caleb could feel the tension beneath the surface now. Elaine wasn't the architect. She was leverage. Blackridge had used her debt to clear the board. The realization reframed his anger. It wasn't about family betrayal anymore. It was about corporate control. He climbed into his truck and glanced once more at the diner window. Elaine remained seated, staring into her untouched coffee. As Caleb drove back toward the granary, the foothills loomed larger against the sky. The emotional shift settled fully now. Betrayal had turned into clarity. The enemy had a name. And for the first time, Caleb felt something stronger than rage. Direction. He glanced at Viper. We need allies, he said quietly. The dog's ears flicked forward. In the rearview mirror, a dark SUV rolled slowly out of town, maintaining distance, watching. Caleb didn't look back again. Not this time. The SUV in his rearview mirror kept its distance for 3 miles before turning off toward the highway. Caleb tracked it calmly, memorizing the shape of its grille, the dust pattern along its panels. Then it was gone. The pasture road to the granary stretched ahead, pale and open beneath a widening sky. The mountains stood steady and indifferent, their snowcaps catching late morning light. They're testing boundaries, Caleb said quietly. Viper shifted in the passenger seat, nose angled toward the wind drifting through the cracked window. Back at the granary, Caleb parked inside the sagging chain-link fence and closed the gate behind him. He reinforced it with a length of logging chain he'd found in an old storage shed. He stood in the yard for a long moment, scanning the hills. He no longer felt hunted. He felt engaged. Inside the granary office, he spread the evidence across the metal desk. Soil reports, maps, the digital drives, his father's handwritten notes. The weight of it felt heavier now, not because of fear, but because of possibility. He needed verification. He needed witnesses. He needed someone who understood how to shine light without getting swallowed by it. By afternoon, Caleb was back in town. The Crestfall Library sat beside the church, brick facade faded but solid. Inside, sunlight poured through tall windows, dust floating in quiet beams. He found her at a long wooden table stacked with newspapers and a laptop covered in travel stickers. Maya Ortiz. He recognized her from articles pinned in the hardware store, investigative pieces about water contamination in rural counties, zoning disputes, small-town corruption. She wasn't local by birth, but she had stayed long enough to earn wary respect. She looked up as Caleb approached. You're the one in the north pasture, she said, studying him openly. Granary owner, Caleb replied. Former SEAL, she added. He didn't react. I need a journalist, he said simply. Maya leaned back in her chair. That depends, she said, on whether you need publicity or protection. Both. He placed a soil toxicity report on the table. Her expression shifted. Where did you get this? From land that's not supposed to be contaminated. She scanned the data quickly. These readings are extreme. There's more. They moved to a private study room. Caleb laid out maps showing rail spurs and buried sites, cross-referenced with property acquisitions by Blackridge Infrastructure over the past decade. Maya's eyes sharpened. They've been consolidating rural parcels near abandoned transport lines, she said slowly. Under agricultural redevelopment permits, Caleb added. She nodded. That's a loophole. Viper sat quietly by the door, ears rotating at every sound in the hallway. Maya closed the folder. If this is legitimate, it's not just local corruption, she said. It's federal. It's real, Caleb said. She studied him carefully. And why bring it to me? Because they already know I have it. Her jaw tightened slightly. You've been approached? Yes. Threatened? Encouraged. Maya gave a thin smile. Classic corporate diplomacy. She stood. I'll verify the data independently. I have a contact in Cheyenne who can run parallel soil tests. Caleb nodded. But understand, she added, once this goes public, it doesn't go halfway. It goes all the way. That's the point. Later that evening, Caleb made a second stop. The sheriff's office sat at the far end of town, beside the volunteer fire department. The building was modest, brick walls, 2 patrol vehicles parked out front. Sheriff Dalton Reeves opened the door himself. He was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples. His gaze lingered on Caleb's posture. You've got that look, Reeves said, like you're carrying something heavy. Caleb stepped inside. Sir, I need to report an attempted break-in. Reeves listened without interrupting, as Caleb described the forced door, the contractor badge, the SUV tailing him out of town. You have the badge? Reeves asked. Caleb placed it on the desk. Reeves examined it closely. Blackridge, he muttered. You know them? They've been sniffing around here for months, Reeves said. Buying up parcels, quietly. Any complaints? Nothing solid. Caleb leaned forward. I have something solid. He didn't reveal the full cache, only enough to suggest contamination and illegal dumping. Reeves's expression darkened. My brother ran cattle near here for 30 years, the sheriff said quietly. Died from a rare cancer 3 years ago. Silence settled heavily between them. If they're poisoning ground, Reeves continued, we'll find out. Caleb nodded. I'll increase patrols near your property, Reeves said. And if anyone steps foot on it without a warrant, you call me. As Caleb left the station, dusk was settling over Crestfall. The mountains glowed purple. Hope felt unfamiliar in his chest. Not fragile, not naive. Steady. Back at the granary, Maya arrived just before nightfall in a dusty Subaru loaded with camera equipment. She stepped out and looked up at the massive steel structure. This is cinematic, she said softly. It's stubborn, Caleb replied. They walked the perimeter together. Viper ranged ahead, nose low, scanning. Maya photographed disturbed soil near the fence line. Your dog's tracking something, she observed. He doesn't move without reason. At the edge of the pasture, Viper stopped and began pawing lightly at a patch of ground where weeds grew unevenly. Caleb knelt beside him. The soil was looser here. He marked the spot. We'll test that, Maya said. Night fell quickly. They sat on the loading dock, lantern glowing between them. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Caleb did not feel alone. Maya outlined her plan. Coordinated release, environmental lab confirmations, interviews with affected families. Sheriff Reeves would quietly gather complaints and medical records. The granary would become more than a relic. It would become evidence headquarters. Viper rested his head across Caleb's boot, breathing slow and steady. The wind moved gently through the tall grass. Caleb looked out across the darkening pasture. "They thought isolating me would make this easier," he said. Maya glanced at him. "Isolation is their strategy," she said. "Community is yours." He considered that. The emotional weight shifted again. From solitary resolve to shared determination. Above them, the stars emerged one by one. Blackridge had expected silence. Instead, the circle was widening. And for the first time since the lock changed at the ranch house door, Caleb felt something that resembled forward motion. Hope. Not loud, not dramatic, but growing. Hope settled into Caleb's chest like a steady ember. Warm, controlled, purposeful. For 2 weeks, momentum built quietly. Maya worked her contacts in Cheyenne, verifying soil samples pulled from the marked pasture and 2 neighboring properties. Sheriff Reeves increased patrols, logging vehicle plates that passed the North Ridge Road after dusk. Farmers who had once avoided eye contact began stopping by the granary fence, asking careful questions. The contamination reports came back confirmed. Elevated industrial solvents. Long-term exposure risks. It wasn't speculation anymore. It was proof. Maya arranged a secure handoff with a senior editor in Cheyenne, someone outside Blackridge's local influence. The evidence would move out of Crestfall, be backed up, digitized, and protected. Caleb volunteered to transport the physical files. He trusted no one else with the originals. Snow began falling the morning they planned the drive. Thin at first, then heavier. By afternoon, the foothills wore a white veil. "You don't have to do this alone," Maya said, standing beside his truck as wind pushed snow across the gravel lot. "I won't be alone," Caleb replied, glancing at Viper in the passenger seat. The dog's flank still bore a faint scar from the break-in, but he moved strong and focused. Maya hesitated. "Be careful." Caleb nodded once. The truck rolled north along Ridge Road, tires crunching through fresh powder. The route curved between steep hills and narrow drop-offs, where guardrails were little more than suggestion. The sky pressed low and gray. Inside the cab, the heater hummed softly. The evidence case rested on the seat behind him, strapped down with bungee cords. Viper watched the side mirror, ears shifting. Caleb noticed first the absence of other vehicles, then the headlights. A dark SUV appeared behind him, distant but steady. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. He maintained speed. The SUV closed the gap gradually, too gradually. He checked the front. The road ahead empty, winding sharply toward a wooded ridge. Snow thickened, visibility narrowing. Viper stiffened. Caleb's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The SUV surged forward suddenly, engine roaring through the muffled snow. It struck the rear bumper hard enough to fishtail the truck sideways. Caleb corrected instinctively, counter-steering with controlled precision. The SUV hit again, this time harder. The truck slid toward the edge of the ridge. Tires fought for traction. The guardrail splintered under impact. The world tilted. Metal screamed, then stopped. The truck came to rest at an angle, front end hanging inches from a steep drop into snow-packed timber. Silence, except for the ticking engine and falling snow. Caleb inhaled sharply, checking himself. No immediate pain. He turned. "Viper!" The dog was already upright, braced against the dash. The SUV door slammed outside. Boots crunched toward the truck. Caleb unlatched his seatbelt slowly, eyes scanning. 3 figures approached through the snow. Dark jackets, faces partially obscured. Not panicked. Professional. One raised a hand toward the driver's door. Caleb moved first. He kicked the door open hard, forcing the nearest man backward. Snow burst into the cab. Viper launched past him in a blur of motion. The second man stumbled, arms flailing as Viper collided into his chest, driving him into the drift. The third reached beneath his coat. Caleb reacted without thinking, muscle memory overriding shock. He pivoted, using controlled force to deflect the arm away while shoving the attacker off balance into the snowbank. The first man recovered and lunged again. Caleb blocked and forced distance, breath steady, movements precise. Snow swirled thickly around them. Then a sharp sound cracked the air. Viper yelped. Caleb's heart dropped. The dog staggered backward, flank darkening against white snow. The world narrowed instantly. Caleb moved with focused intensity, disarming the nearest attacker with decisive control and forcing him face down into the snow. The others scrambled, retreating toward the SUV. Tires spun wildly as they reversed down the ridge road and disappeared into falling white. Silence returned. Only wind and Caleb's breathing. He turned. Viper stood unsteady, blood seeping along his side, staining the snow. "Stay with me," Caleb whispered urgently, dropping to his knees. He pressed his jacket against the wound, hands steady despite the tremor rising in his chest. "Stay." Viper's eyes locked on his. Alert, trusting. Caleb's composure cracked then, not into panic, but into something deeper. Fear. Real fear. Not for himself. For the one living soul who had followed him through every night since overseas. He fumbled for his phone, calling Sheriff Reeves with clipped precision. "Ambush. Ridge Road. Need immediate medical support. K9 injured." He didn't realize his voice had broken until he heard it echo back through the receiver. He pulled Viper closer against him, shielding him from falling snow. "It's okay," he murmured. "You did good. You did your job." Viper's breathing was shallow but steady. Snow continued falling, soft and indifferent. Minutes stretched long. Caleb rocked slightly, keeping pressure firm against the wound. For the first time since returning home, his eyes filled openly, not from memory, not from shame, but from the thought of loss. Sirens echoed faintly down the ridge. Relief surged sharp and sudden. Sheriff Reeves's cruiser arrived first, lights flashing against the snowfall. An emergency responder truck followed close behind. They worked quickly, lifting Viper onto a stretcher board designed for livestock transport. "He's strong," the paramedic said calmly. "We've got him." Caleb stood frozen for half a second before climbing into the back with them. The evidence case remained strapped in the truck, untouched. As the vehicles descended the ridge toward Crestfall, snow continued covering tire tracks. But something fundamental had shifted. The escalation was no longer subtle. Blackridge had crossed into open aggression, and Viper had taken the cost. Caleb stared down at the dog as they drove. "I won't let this be for nothing," he whispered. Outside the ambulance windows, the mountains watched silently. Hope had grown. Now it was under fire. The veterinary clinic in Crestfall was small. White siding, green trim, a single glowing sign against the falling snow. Caleb stood just inside the surgical room doorway as Dr. Hannah Pierce worked over Viper beneath bright overhead lights. "Bullet passed clean through the flank," she said steadily. "Missed bone, missed vital organs. He's lucky." Lucky. Caleb leaned against the wall, arms folded tight across his chest, trying to slow his breathing. Viper lay still on the table, sedated but stable. The rise and fall of his chest was the only movement Caleb needed to see. Sheriff Reeves stepped into the room quietly. "We recovered tire impressions down the ridge," he said. SUV was stolen out of Billings 2 days ago. Plates switched. They planned this. Caleb nodded once. The men, he asked. Gone, but not invisible. Reeves held Caleb's gaze. You were justified in defending yourself, he added firmly. Caleb didn't respond. His eyes stayed on the dog. After surgery, Viper was moved to recovery. Tubes ran from his leg to a clear IV bag. His fur had been shaved along his side, stitches neat and precise. Caleb pulled a chair close and sat. He didn't sleep. By morning, snow had stopped. Sunlight poured through the clinic windows, bright against fresh drifts. Viper stirred first. His ears twitched. Then his eyes opened. Caleb leaned forward immediately. Easy, he said softly. Viper's gaze focused slowly. Recognition settled in. His tail thumped weakly against the blanket. Caleb exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. You're not allowed to check out early, he murmured. Later that afternoon, Maya arrived at the clinic carrying her camera bag and a thick folder. You were attacked, she said without preamble. Yes. And Viper? He'll recover. She nodded. I released the first segment this morning, she said. Local feed first, then state, then national. Caleb blinked. That fast? They crossed a line, she said quietly. Attempted assault changes the narrative. She handed him her phone. The screen showed a headline. Rural Wyoming landowner ambushed amid toxic waste investigation. Below it, images of the granary, soil sample charts, an interview clip from Sheriff Reeves stating the attack was under investigation. And then, footage Maya had recorded days earlier. Caleb standing beside the granary, Viper at his heel. Caleb watched silently. The report was measured, evidence-based, calm, but powerful. By evening, major outlets had picked up the story. Black Ridge Infrastructure issued a public statement denying involvement and calling the allegations baseless. Within hours, federal environmental regulators announced preliminary reviews into rural land acquisitions across 3 counties. Phone calls began flooding into Sheriff Reeves's office. Farmers reporting unusual illnesses, livestock abnormalities, long-forgotten complaints resurfacing. At the clinic, Caleb sat beside Viper as the dog slept. His phone buzzed continuously. He ignored most of it, until one message made him pause. From Maya. Federal task force en route to inspect properties, including yours. The next morning, a convoy of government vehicles rolled into Crestfall, marked SUVs, unmarked sedans. Men and women in windbreakers carrying clipboards and sealed evidence cases. Caleb stood outside the granary as they approached. Snow still covered parts of the pasture, but tracks from the ambush were visible along Ridge Road. Maya filmed quietly from a distance. Sheriff Reeves coordinated perimeter control. Agents descended into the weigh station chamber after Caleb revealed the hidden hatch. They examined the waterproof case, the drives, the documented soil samples. One agent looked up at Caleb. Your father built a strong record, she said. He believed in documentation, Caleb replied. The agent nodded. He also understood timing. By late afternoon, warrants were issued for multiple Black Ridge subsidiary sites across the state. Television crews gathered at the base of the pasture hill, cameras pointed upward toward the granary. Caleb stood on the loading dock. Reporters shouted questions. Mr. Mercer, when did you first suspect foul play? Did your stepmother know? Were you targeted because of your military background? Caleb raised a hand slightly. The noise quieted. This isn't about me, he said clearly. It's about land that was treated like it didn't matter. About families who didn't know what was under their feet. His voice stayed steady. My father tried to protect this place. I'm just finishing what he started. Behind him, Viper lay on a thick blanket near the doorway, stitches visible but healing. The dog's presence anchored the image. Maya captured it all. By nightfall, Blackridge's stock dropped sharply. Corporate offices in Denver were raided under federal order. Nathan Kessler's name appeared in an indictment notice. Elaine watched the broadcast from her living room, silent. In Crestfall, something shifted. Neighbors who once kept distance now drove up the North Pasture Road carrying thermoses and spare lumber. Farmers offered affidavits. Retired veterans stopped by simply to stand on the loading dock and look out at the mountains. The granary was no longer abandoned. It was visible. Caleb stood alone at the edge of the pasture that evening, hands in his pockets. Snow melted slowly under the returning sun. Viper limped to his side, leaning gently against his leg. "You see that?" Caleb murmured. Below them, federal vehicles loaded equipment. Evidence once buried was now catalogued. Spotlight instead of secrecy. The building that had nearly been erased was now central, not as a relic, as proof. Caleb exhaled. The fear that had tightened his chest for weeks loosened slightly. The fight wasn't finished. Legal proceedings would stretch long, but something decisive had already occurred. Truth had crossed the threshold. He looked down at Viper. "You found it," he said softly. The dog's tail moved once. Above them, the mountains caught the last gold of sunset. The granary doors stood open, and for the first time, the war felt winnable. Spring came slow to the Wyoming foothills, but when it arrived, it did not whisper. It stretched wide and unapologetic across the pasture. Snowmelt fed the creek at the base of the ridge. Wild grass returned in soft green waves. The mountains stood clearer, less harsh, their edges softened by light. Blackridge infrastructure collapsed under the weight of federal investigation. Executives were indicted, subsidiary permits revoked. Cleanup crews, overseen by environmental agencies, began the long process of excavation and soil restoration across affected properties. The granary remained standing through it all, not condemned, not seized, protected. Caleb stood on the loading dock one morning, watching a flatbed truck pull up the dirt road. The side read, "Wyoming Veteran Services, Outreach Division." Behind him, the interior of the granary had changed. The dust was gone. Steel beams reinforced, windows replaced. The old way station platform remained intact, preserved as a reminder of where the truth had been uncovered. But the space around it had transformed. Wooden partitions framed modest sleeping quarters along one wall. A communal kitchen took shape near the former loading bay. Storage racks once meant for grain now held donated tools, blankets, and supplies. And near the center of the main floor stood a series of kennels, sturdy, clean, purpose-built. Viper moved carefully but confidently between them. His scar was permanent now, fur growing uneven over the stitched line along his flank. He no longer sprinted as sharply as before, but he moved with deliberate authority. Caleb knelt as a young German Shepherd mix hesitated near the kennel door. "It's okay," he said gently. The dog's owner stood a few steps back, a man in his late 20s, shoulders hunched, eyes scanning every noise. Former Army, PTSD diagnosis, recently discharged. Caleb recognized the posture instantly. "You don't have to explain anything," Caleb told him. "You just have to show up." The man swallowed and nodded once. Sheriff Reeves helped carry in folding tables. Maya filmed from a respectful distance, documenting not scandal now, but rebuilding. Elaine had left Crestfall quietly 2 months earlier. The ranch sold through proper channels. Her absence no longer felt like a wound. The granary had become something else, something forward. Late one afternoon, Caleb gathered 5 veterans inside the main hall. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes that no longer represented neglect, but activity. "You all know why we're here," Caleb said evenly. He stood beside the preserved way station. "My father believed land mattered, that if you protect it, it protects you back." He gestured toward the kennels. "Dogs understand that better than most people." A few quiet smiles formed. "We rebuild structures," Caleb continued. "We rebuild routines, and we rebuild trust. That's the mission." Viper stepped forward slowly and sat at Caleb's side. The room settled. The building that had once symbolized abandonment now carried a different weight. Purpose. Weeks passed. More veterans arrived. Some stayed for days, some for months. They repaired fencing across the pasture, planted a small garden near the south wall, cleared debris from neighboring land still under federal remediation. Caleb worked alongside them, not as a commander, but as a peer. There were difficult nights. Flashbacks did not vanish with indictments. There were moments when a dropped tool or sudden thunderclap froze someone mid-step. But there was also laughter, shared meals, dogs trained patiently beside men learning to breathe through panic again. One evening, as the sun lowered gold across the foothills, Caleb climbed onto the loading dock with Viper. Below them, 2 veterans ran through obedience drills with their rescue dogs. Maya stood near the fence line, capturing footage not for headlines now, but for memory. Sheriff Reeves leaned against his cruiser, arms crossed loosely. The pasture glowed. Caleb crouched and ran his hand along Viper's scar. "You saved more than me," he said quietly. Viper leaned into his touch. Caleb looked out across the land that had once felt like a battlefield. The way station remained inside, untouched, honored. He thought about the day the ranch door had shut behind him, about the cardboard box of belongings, about the nights sleeping in his truck. He thought about the ambush on Ridge Road, about the moment he believed he might lose the only steady presence he had left. And he thought about the recording, his father's voice echoing through steel walls. "Protect the land. Trust your instincts. Trust the dog." Caleb stood slowly. The wind carried the scent of earth and pine. Veterans' voices drifted upward from the yard. He felt it then. Not adrenaline, not defiance. Peace. Not because the world had changed entirely, but because he had. He had chosen to stay, chosen to build, chosen to turn a symbol of rejection into shelter. He looked down at Viper and spoke softly, almost to himself. "We stayed." The words settled into the evening air. Below them, the granary doors remained wide open. Inside, light filled every corner that had once been shadow. Above them, the mountains stood quiet witness. And for the first time since returning to Crestfall, Caleb Mercer did not feel like a displaced soldier. He felt home. If you believe some land is worth standing your ground for, type yes in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Around here, we believe justice may take time, but it still matters. If stories like this speak to you, go ahead and subscribe, and stay with us for more real stories about dignity, perseverance, and fighting for what's right in the land of the free.